second plane hit the second tower on September 11th, 2001, I knew that I lived in a nation that didn't know a Hindu from a Sikh, from a Buddhist, from anything else. And I also realized that this would be an ideological war. When on September 11th, my phone began to ring from different friends calling me and saying, "You said there was going to be a big hit. How did you know that?" I said, "Well, I read their playbook," because I'd started reading about Islam and when I was a college professor and had many Muslim students. So I'd already read the Quran, then I read Muhammad's life. So when Osama bin Laden called America to Islam, I knew that we were going to get whacked. And indeed, it was a classic. He attacked a financial center in the morning in a surprise attack, just as Muhammad preferred, after he had called them to Islam. So I made it my purpose to make the doctrine of Islam easy to read. When I say the doctrine of Islam, I mean the Quran, the Sirah, the life of Muhammad, and the Hadith, his traditions. I wanted to make all of these a source so that everyone could become their own expert. The only expert I refer to is Dr. Allah and Professor Muhammad. And that's what I teach my students. I don't teach them about experts. I teach them what Muhammad said and did and what the Quran says. I produced a Quran that's readable. So therefore, my students can discuss Islam in basics and on the basis of not what a Muslim says, particularly a modern Muslim. They can do it on the basis of what they find in the doctrine. Now, to the point of view about what is political Islam, I read religious literature all of my life. I was raised a Christian, and by the time I was 16 years old, I was teaching the adult Bible class. I've studied the Torah. I've studied some Hindu scriptures. I've studied Zen Buddhism. So religion is very important to me. It is, although I do not now have a religion, I think it is a good thing because it teaches morals and brings a unity to a nation if done right. So the thing that struck me when I read the Islamic doctrine for the first time was how much of it was about me and you, not about how to be a Muslim. When you read a Buddhist sutra, it becomes a doctrine that is concerned with being a better Buddhist. But over half, 51% of the Quran, Sirah, Hadith text is devoted to the Kafir. As a matter of fact, the word Kafir is so important, I went through and counted up how many times it's used. It's used 345 times in the Quran to designate an unbeliever. So I'm a Kafir and you're a Kafir. I call that part of Islam that deals with the Kafir political Islam. Why do I call it political? Because it is definitely not religious. Let me give you an example between the difference between political Islam and religious Islam. In America now, it's quite common, not in America, but in Europe, it's quite common for Muslims to commandeer the street and do Friday prayers. And some people say, well, they need to do that because their God commands them to pray on Friday. The prayer is Islamic, is religious. Commandeering the street and shutting down the traffic is a political act. So we need to see that it's the political part of Islam that affects us. I could care less about the religion of Islam. I don't care if they get 72 virgins or whatever else. I simply have no care about their religion whatsoever at all, other than to say it's unattractive to me. So what's important about Islam is what it says about you and me. I'd like to add something here about what's important about what we're doing now. We are the 5% talking to ourselves who are a member of the 5%, and what I call the 5%. One of the things that's happened in 20 years since 9/11 is that many people now know the doctrine of Islam. But I find this, the higher you go, the less they know. I literally created this rule because of talking with a general one time about political Islam. He knew absolutely nothing and didn't want to talk about it. But I found that if you talk with soldiers who had been in Iraq or Afghanistan, that they knew more about Islam than the generals did. So we're involved in an ideological war. The only way we're going to win is to convince our leadership the true nature of Islam, which everyone on this panel knows about. So what we have to do is we have to democratize our information so that everyone knows it. I, for instance, am all for Islam being taught in the schools. And when I say Islam, I mean teach them who Muhammad was, teach them what's in the Quran. Because I found that once people, and by the way, I know a Christian who has converted 2,400 Muslims to Christianity. How does he do it? He has a 2-hour method he uses in which he gets Muslims to educate themselves as to what's in the Quran and who Muhammad was. He does this in a very slow method asking of questions. This is ideological war. Now, most people don't want to know how to convert anybody. So he's been ineffective other than having personal success. But what I'm saying here is that most Muslims know nothing about Islam, and the best way to de-radicalize them, a poor term indeed, is to teach them exactly what is in the Quran. It is my experience that jihadis know the Quran very well. Jihadis understand the doctrine very well. So we need to take the knowledge that we have and make it available to all. And when I say all, in particular, our leaders. This is going to be difficult to do because in the United States, people such as myself are called racist, hater, bigot, Islamophobes. So people don't want to hear me. If I tried to speak on a college campus here in the United States, there would be, if not a riot, at least protest. The United States is slowly giving up on critical thought, which is a tragedy, because the cornerstone of our civilization is what I call the golden rule, treating others as you would be treated. And our intellectual cornerstone is critical thought. We're giving up on critical thought. Now, Muslims' civilization is based on a dualistic ethical principle. That is, you treat another Muslim as a brother, but there are 13 verses in the Quran which say that a Muslim is never a brother or a true friend of a Kafir. So that's the nature of Islam, and we need to understand that. So what we have here is a lot of knowledge. We now can...
Dr. Warner?
Yes.
I would like to ask you a question which only I think you can answer very, very well. And it is this, that a non-Muslim is standing on the outside of Islam and looking in. How does one arrive at an appropriate lexicon or a terminology to define Islam?
Very important question. Very important question. Aristotle, one of the great philosophers of the West, taught that naming was one of the most powerful things you could do. For instance, we use the word terrorism. It's not terrorism, it's jihad. We shouldn't use the word terrorism because what's the difference? I could be a terrorist, but if you're a jihadist, you have an entire doctrine behind you. So therefore, it's an ideological war, and we need to deal with those who know Islam best, and they happen to be the jihadis. We need to explain to all people what the nature of Islam is and for instance, another thing we don't want to do is use modern Islam or radical Islam. You may think that cutting off people's heads is radical, or flying planes into buildings is radical, but it is not radical, it is normative. There are two kinds of Muslims, basically. When you break the Quran down into its early form, Mecca, and then the latter form, Medina, you discover that in Mecca there was no jihad. There was only argumentation. And in Medina, 24% of the Quran written in Medina is about jihad. So here we see two important things. Number one, there's a dualism. Islam always has two opinions about any subject. And people want to argue, well, which one is the right one? I say, no, it is a principle called dualism. That is, both the Meccan Quran is true and so is the Medinan Quran true. But they contradict each other, you say. That is the nature of Islam. People have tried to resolve the contradiction, and what I've done as a scientist is simply to incorporate it in and call it dualism. They're both equally true, except the latter one is stronger than the first one.